But okay, anyway, let's formally get started. This particular meeting of the patrons is to cover the subject matter of warfare. And even though obviously, we're still at earlier phases of the game, it's good to kind of talk about these more advanced concepts that we'll be integrating because we want to have something to aspire to, and we want to be able to get the fundamental architecture of the game down so that we can build atop that a satisfying and complex system. And so one thing we want to do differently about warfare that you don't see in most games is we really want to be able to capture a lot of the experience and a lot of the factors that influenced warfare outside of just the tactical battle. You have a lot of total warfare type games where the most important factor of winning a war was like what actually happened on the battlefield, when in reality I'd say through most of history frequently the opposite was true. It wasn't really necessarily some general's clever tactics that was the foundation of their victory, but whether they could get their soldiers to the battle to begin with, whether they can outmaneuver their enemies on a strategic map, whether the soldiers were well fed when they showed up to battle, whether the soldiers were loyal and not just low morale auxiliaries that you had yanked off of a farm from some society you had subjugated. And so those are a lot of things we'll want to cover in warfare that aren't typically considered. We kind of want to bring the strategic map to, I guess, the tactical battle, so to speak. But so if we want to start out with some questions, I know typical name you had mentioned some really interesting things in Inner Circle chat, I think yesterday, and so I thought a lot of questions you had would be great to start the conversation. So I will give the floor to you.
Okay, if I remember correctly, the conversation you're talking about, it's been a few months since I asked those earlier questions about the military, but what I had said yesterday, I remember I was comparing the idea to how it works in the game Victoria 2, which you might be familiar with. And one of the things I liked about Victoria 2 was like it kept track of like individual like demographics of populations. Like you would have so and so many populations of Sunni Turks in this province and Sunni Greeks in this other province, and so on and so forth. And when you built military units like from your provinces, like they would be tied to a given population, like and as would your workers. And this was really relevant to the mechanics specifically for the military, because the military units would retain their loyalties to the population you recruited them from. So, for example, if I'm the British Empire and I'm colonizing Africa, I probably do not want to guard my Nigerian colonies with peasants I conscripted from Nigeria, because in the event that area rebels, they will probably defect to the rebel side. So I was wondering, like, if there would be mechanics kind of like that in some of the add-ons.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, anyone who takes up arms will ultimately be from a particular population with a specific culture that belongs to a specific province, right? And so and we're hoping that can play a major role in a lot of, it can play a lot of different factors. So, for instance, even the lifestyle. If you pull from. If you put a pop under arms that is from like a feral society versus a settled farming society, the kind of soldiers that you'd get out of it, their kind of temperament, their ability to go to war, pre-training, would be significantly different, right? So think in terms of like for instance, steppe people who a lot of what's involved in their lifestyle for just living is actually very complementary to warfare. So like someone who's raised in the saddle, who uses the bow for hunting on a regular basis even when they're not at war, someone like that, you go ahead and you raise them as a military unit or a soldier in warfare. What you're going to get as far as their ability to act in warfare is going to be very different than like the farmer that you yanked off the farm who doesn't really have a lot of transmissible warfare skills, you'll get something significantly different. But aside from just performance in warfare, like, you should expect that someone, if you pull a pop from a land that's not particularly loyal, or you pull a pop from a province that requires that they be home in time for the harvest, and then you don't get home for the harvest, like, you can expect that there to be different levels of loyalty and toleration of a long campaign or a punishing campaign. Those are all things that we would hope would be reflected in warfare when the time comes. So yeah, absolutely.
I wanted to ask about some stuff that we haven't really talked about yet, which is, we've talked a lot about how we're planning to have state-influenced war and campaigns being managed, in the sense that we're planning for them not to be very all-controlling, if that makes sense. But a lot of, like, I venture to say, most of conflicts, military conflicts in all of real-life history, were not state-based. So, for example, a Scottish person going over to an English farm to steal sheep he did not have the blessing from the king, he did not blah blah blah. The Gazas in Ottoman Turkey raiding into other states in Anatolia were not necessarily patronized by the Ottoman Sultan. Are we planning to have extra play outside of the player control? Are we planning to have populations, even within your own quote-unquote polity, fight each other / other people?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Right, and it depends on whether there's like a cultural tradition of that kind of activity. So, like, that's one of the, hopefully, one of the magical things about the agent-based model. Like, a population in a given province might be disposed to that particular kind of activity, and if it's, regardless of whether it's given the blessing of a ruler or not, if you don't control the people that live in the province here, and they have some free time on their hands, while the crops are growing or something like that, and they want to raid the other culture nearby, I think that's absolutely something. That's a decision that would be made on their level, at the province level of a specific agent or a specific pop, and they would evaluate, for instance, like, oh, well, is this something that's even worthwhile for us? Do we have too much stuff that needs to be done here at home? Is it something that's going to be tolerated by our liege? What is the potential reward? So they'll run these kinds of calculations, especially if they have a sort of a cultural tradition of this kind of behavior, and then kind of make those decisions, and then you as the ruler will have to react to whether you want that to be happening. And of course, it can end up being an advantageous situation, like under the Ottomans. You had all of these other beyliks who would be kind of behaving semi-autonomously, wanting to raid enemy territory, and to some extent it was advantageous because they'd be sort of weakening your enemies for you. But then again, it can cause a diplomatic crisis because suddenly the people that are getting raided are like, hey, these are your subjects nominally under your control. You need to exert some kind of behavior over them. What's interesting is you can even see this kind of behavior in the modern sense, when you go to the region between Afghanistan and Pakistan, where, like, you have Pashtuns nominally under the control of Pakistan, and they kind of don't really have control over the fact that they're, attacking into Afghanistan. And so, yeah, I think definitely we want to build an infrastructure into the game where you have agents behaving on their own initiative. And of course, this kind of thing can easily turn into banditry too, which we could have organic banditry in the same fashion as well, working off of this model, right? So if the people of a province, are subject to a lot of hardship and are desperate, some of the young men can form bands, and if they don't have, nearby polities outside of your own, geopolitical unit to raid, they might just turn to banditry from within. So, does that answer the question?
Yeah. Also, alongside of that, we see that for a long time in history, war was just like the correct thing to do when you're not harvesting.
Right.
Like it was beneficial for people to spend manpower to take things from other people rather than just stand by and do nothing. In that system, if we're trying to aspire to have something reasonably similar to that happening, I'd imagine war and the system that we end up for harvests and food, particularly, would have to be pretty interconnected. Is there a plan in the development stage to like link doing both these things together so that they work together as best they can?
Absolutely. So basically, the idea is that each pops have to decide what they're going to be doing throughout their year, depending on the kind of lifestyle that they're living. And so, like what you were describing, I think like the annual raiding season type of situation, I think was really common in terms of like if you think in SotE terms, how you have feral societies and settled societies. I think as feral societies make that kind of transition to settled agriculture, they have a situation where like you have your planting season, you have your harvest season, and then you have this chunk of time where your economy's not quite developed enough to do like what a lot of the Chinese did in the Yangtze Delta, which is like, oh, okay, we have this free time, let's spin a bunch of cloth or something, But society's too young to be doing something like that, and so instead you can either choose to hunt, which is a legit activity if there's enough wilderness nearby, or you can choose to like raid that weaker neighbor and take their stuff, and so I think that kind of decision would be made on the pop level as they're deciding what to do with their free time and whether they've been rewarded in the past for this activity or things like that, So I think that's definitely I think that's perfectly viable and something that we'd want to have.
On the state level, then, is it reasonable to assume that it will be considerably easier for the player state to recruit things to war when where the population actually wants to do war? And so perhaps a considerable amount of the war part of this game will be convincing the population to want to go to war in the first place.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and it's something it's probably something I've never mentioned before, but it's been on my mind a lot, which is basically your ability to succeed in war will largely be in part, convincing people by hook or crook or bribe that it's a good idea to go to war. So it's like, if you just have personal ambitions to annex foreign territory, like no one's going to be interested in that. No one's going to be enthusiastic about it if there's not something in it for them. And this is right. This is like how like campaigns of annexation and conquest so often involved so much pillaging and looting, because like that was the only real way you could, like in most earlier kind of conflicts, like you weren't paying your soldiers much of a salary, if at all, and so it's like you promised spoils, right? And this also explains how you ended up with a lot of autocatalytic conquests, like Alexander the Great or the Khans, or any number of these rapid the Islamic conquests as well, where it starts out small. You've got a charismatic leader who wins a bunch of booty for his soldiers, and then soon everyone who's remotely related to your culture group is like, well, hell, I want in on the action, and your army gets bigger and bigger. What's funny is that when Alexander originally went off to war into Persia, he had enough money to pay like for supplies for like 1 month, and so he was basically like wanted to conquer Persia, but knew that like he would just have to generate revenue as he went in order to succeed at it. So, but largely, go ahead.
This creates a sort of potential thing, like Alexander, for example, where the player might get all his population all ready for a war, and then as soon as he goes in, he realizes this is perhaps not the best use of my time. But then, like, you said that Alexander wanted to conquer Persia, but on the other hand, maybe he didn't. Just sort of, once he put the foot in,
that's true.
He can't really back out anymore. So is there going to be a potential for players to be quote unquote held hostage by their army wanting to take over things?
That's a good question. If there's this, I could imagine being stuck in a situation where you've intentionally kind of promoted a culture of conquest, and suddenly you realize, like, okay, I'm not going to be able to hold this thing together unless... I mean, this is why so many empires just fell to pieces often, like, after you build it, you know. Suddenly, all of that profit motive for all of your soldiers is gone. There's nothing left to plausibly conquer. And so then, like, everyone just kind of, starts staking out land for themselves. But, I could definitely see a situation where... I'm not sure how. I'm trying to think about the architecture of how we implement it. Like, because whenever we're talking about this thing, I'm thinking, like, okay, so where's the data going to be stored? Someone's, how do we keep it within parameters? So I'd have to think about that a little bit more. But it's an interesting idea. I was definitely thinking of, like, in terms of promoting a culture, like when we were talking about raiding neighbors earlier, like agents kind of doing what they wanted to. You kind of intentionally promoting that behavior and then ending up in a situation where you have to tell them no, and they're like, fuck you, and they do it anyway, and then you're screwed. But
kind of maybe building off that, like, not necessarily at this time point in history, but use a later example. Like, one of the major reasons that the 30 Years' War in Europe was so hard to resolve was because you had all these mercenaries, and there was, like, this back and forth between the different sides of, all right, who's going to pay off all these mercenaries so they actually stop fighting and go home, as opposed to just, continuing pillaging the land and destroying the place.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, is your agents, I imagine, like, the agents in your army, if you don't have super tight control of them, if you're just, like, if you get together some of your nobles and some of your people who aren't super loyal to you, and they get in the habit of kind of, if they've been up and campaigning for a super long time, you could end up with a situation like, with, Catalan mercenaries, like you did with Catalan mercenaries, conquering Athens, or, Normans all over the place kind of out for themselves, conquering Sicily and all over the place. So, yeah, that's an interesting point that you can... And that's kind of another thing, like mercenaries. We'd like for mercenaries to be able to kind of roam the land looking for opportunity and sort of be peripherally related to the land that they originally came from. And at some point they might decide to strike out on their own, or go adventuring and stuff like that. But I may have gone off on a slight tangent. But I get the idea.
So like, how would one, going back to the subject of your subjects like attacking each other and other people, like, what would you do to monitor and control that? Specifically monitoring it, because one of the things I didn't like about, to use Paradox games as an example again, Crusader Kings 2 was that, like, there wasn't, like, an easy map mode you could go to see, like, okay, which vassals are fighting with which vassals, and, like, what are my vassals doing, and stuff.
That's true. I think so for instance, I think what CK2 really needed was, they needed some kind of metric kept on provinces that was measuring internal chaos and things of that nature. But it didn't really have that. You kind of, like, you could pass certain laws where, like, oh, okay, you guys can't fight anymore, and things like that. But I think you need both traditions and laws which constrain the activities of agents within your society. But I think what you mentioned is a really good point, which is making sure the player is familiar and aware of everything that's going on inside your society when it comes to, like, armed conflict. Because I remember even playing CK2 recently and, like, just kind of tuning out all of my vassals who were all kicking the crap out of each other, and then all of a sudden I turned on the map mode and the Archduke of Shmuppy Shmup is, like, massive, and I just had no idea it was really happening, and I didn't have the mental bandwidth to to recognize it. So that's
Yeah, there's no good map mode to like keep track of your vassals. Because like if you like go to like the political map mode, it'll show you like your independent realm, which is kind of annoying.
true.
Like and there's like the map mode for like de jure duchies and kingdoms, but like as far as I'm aware, like, there's not really any map mode where you can see like, oh, this kingdom is divided up into this and this vassal.
My friend, let me revolutionize your CK2 experience. Control click on any nation in the political map mode, and it will subdivide into vassals. Only that nation that you clicked.
What?
But aside from that, so there's one thing from CK2 that is like horribly missing, that was just really very, very important, for that particular era, and that is like the degree. I mean, it's basically autonomy, right? How much autonomy a particular area has, which is related to your ability to actually exert control over a vassal. So like in CK, it's like, you can be in like Scotland. Your capital can be in Scotland, and you've got like vassals down in like, I don't know, Occitania or something, and you have just about as much control over them as you do, your territory in Wales or something. And so I think like a lot of the ability of your subjects to be in conflict with other subjects or agents within your society fighting one another would really be the ability of the state to exert control over them due to a variety of factors. The most important one of which is like their proximity to you and your ability to actually enforce laws over them, right? And so, hopefully in Songs of the Aeons, ideally, like the core areas around your capital, which share a relationship with the rulers in the capital, would be the areas you can most easily exert control over, and the places you can get to the most quickly via roads or ships or rivers or whatever. And a lot of the territory, if you have a larger society, a lot of the territory in the hinterlands, you wouldn't really be able to assert much tax control over, but it'd be useful because it was a barrier between, your core lands and the rest of whatever dangers lie beyond.
So kind of like the Meow and Taxes mod for European Universalist 4, where we're like the province autonomy like scaled dramatically with distance.
Absolutely, yeah.
Including like with like various rough terrains and whatnot, slowing your messengers down.
Oh yeah, totally. And so, for instance, if you're back in a valley like this, we would run calculations to determine, like, so if your capital is down here, right, and you've got territory all the way back in here, we'd basically run a calculation. I think I'd worked on the runner system for Mayo and Taxes, where like I basically would send out runners, who would try to find the quickest route to a particular place, and that determined the time it took to get from the capital to that particular place. And so, for instance, we would run some algorithms to see, like, okay, so it takes X number of days to get here from the capital, so we can presume that you can exert this much control over the subjects times these other factors, and that would basically tell you, like, even if you have laws that should bag you quite a bit of taxes and things like that, like, if you can't exert that law pragmatically from a great distance, then you can't really exert that much control over it anyway. And
it'd be interesting to have a mechanic whereby the player himself only gets updated of things that are going on based on the time difference that it would take for you to get updated on things going on.
Yeah.
Because,
go ahead, sorry.
In MNT, like I understood why you guys did the runner system the way you did, which is because that's how the game is. That's how the game works. If you want to influence it, you add autonomy. But autonomy always felt to me like a sort of not the best way, because sure, you're not going to be able to communicate with that area, but that area doesn't mean it's going to give you less economic, surpluses and things. On the other hand, if literally the way that the game worked was the map gets updated only when you are able to hear from the map, it'd be a lot more, I don't know. I think it's an interesting idea and concept.
Well, yeah, there's a couple of points there. So the first point about only getting news based on right? So you're 30 days away. You don't know what happens there until 30 days later, or something like that. And that's really complicated from a data management perspective, It might also make things really complicated for the AI evaluating what to do about different places.
So, I mean, you could make the AI cheat on something like that.
That's
Just
true.
have the AI, give it the same way as the AI has omniscience in most Paradox games, but it's just programmed to pretend like it doesn't. You could program it so that the AI actually does see everything, but it just doesn't think it does until it, sees it when it sees it.
Yeah, that's a possibility. It would, and that's one way to do it, but it's also like, how much would the player like that there's cheating? That's something. I don't really know what the answer to that is. We've thought about it before, and it would be great if we could pull it off, but it might be one of those more trouble than it's worth type of situations. To your second point, Cowboy, about the runners, about like the runner and communication efficiency system of mail and taxes, like I agree. It was even though it was a better concept than what's represented in most games, I thought it was a little bit too linear. Like, so for instance, if you're ruling from the capital here and your very loyal brother is the governor of the province over here, like, they shouldn't just pay less taxes because they're further away, right? And so I think the idea would be that what you would do is the agent that exists in that faraway place will evaluate, okay, do I want more autonomy for myself? Do I want to actually pay less taxes? Do I want to be more independent?
That makes
if yes, can I get away with it, right? So it could be that, like, if you have a city right here next to your capital, like, you may have the motive to want to pay less taxes, but know that you'll never get away with it because an army can just march, or just sail down the river and swat you. Whereas if you're over here in this mountain plateau, you can have the motive and know that you're going to get away with it because the emperor's not going to want to march a big giant army all the way up there to beat you. So you say, hey, you as the agent know you can kind of get away with it. So you pressure for more autonomy with the implication that if they don't get it, then there's going to be problems. So I think that would go ahead.
What if you, the emperor, did send your big army over there anyway?
I guess, yeah, I'm not. I'd have to reason through how that interaction would occur, but like, so if they agitate and then you, for instance, threaten them back or something like that, then it escalates, right? Then they have to, sort of like call the bluff or whatever and follow through with it. And so I would imagine it would kind of be an escalation, right? You would kind of sort of like brinksmanship,
To give a bit of a historical perspective on these things, the way that many societies dealt with this sort of problem that we're flagging up, which is people far away being able to, call the bluff, is that for a long period of time before technology was really, like, even road technology was really able to give reasonable communication, kings, rulers, courts, whatever you want to call them, would be itinerant. They just move around. So
yeah, they wouldn't have a fixed capital.
Yeah, so if your brother was like being uppity, you wouldn't necessarily send an army there. You just move there for the summer, because how's it going to be mean to you to your face?
It's funny that you mentioned that, because last High Council meeting, I think we were talking about how you as the ruler could actually move around, and the events that you get depends on where you're at. So it's like, okay, so this area is causing you problems, you actually go there, and then, deal with it personally so that it's, you have more direct control over, but I mean, when you get to imperial level politics, usually you had armies garrisoned at XYZ location, and so putting down rebellions was a matter of like, okay, marching the army out from the capital. And so when it got to to imperial politics, it was more it was more you had less moving around of monarchs typically, and the court was in the capital or whatever. Yeah, I think too, consider that when you're further away too from where the center of administration is if you have a bureaucratic state. I think that you can also just bullshit a lot more if you're the person in power in the faraway place. You just, whoops, I totally didn't mean to send less taxes. I totally promise I'll get it to you, and it sure would be a shame if the person holding me to account happened to die or be reassigned in their office or something. And so I think faraway locations could more easily, and keep in this is before there were significant censuses too, and so you can easily sort of, if you're far away, make the argument too, like, hey, we don't have this much money, even though we do, and so we can't possibly pay you this much because our economy isn't this big, even though it is. And there's less of it. There's lots of ways to muddy the water. So I can see other ways too, in which distance is able to sort of erode the state's control and benefit from specific territories. I keep going back to that.
To relate this all back to the military stuff that we're here to talk about, I'd assume that the same system would be in effect for like armies, right? If you send an army halfway across the world. Maybe General Jeff, who was previously super loyal to you.
You gotta be careful about General Jeff once he,
go ahead. Just decides to, I have an army, I have a lot of money from moving things down. How's he gonna know? Let me just set up this kingdom right here, real quick.
Sure, and that happened, right, all the time. Yeah, I think, yeah, totally. Agents sort of like behaving in their own interest, seeing that. I mean, how many governors of Britannia, decided that they, would strike out on their own because they were far enough and powerful enough. So yeah, totally. And that's also another case for leading the army yourself. That's why so many, you get into the imperial era of the Romans and in the Byzantine era too, and like so often the emperors had to just lead the army, because if he didn't lead the army, then the guy with all the troops and the admiration of his soldiers could, be marching on the capital, and then you're dead or blind.
So kind of, sorry.
No, it's all right. No, please.
So kind of, I had a thought touching on like the runner and communication time thing, and tying it into the military, I guess too. But like, all right, so say you have your capital in that high mountain plateau region that you were looking at earlier, and it's on the river there. And there's like that mountain range directly to its south, right? So say there's a city on the other side of that, and normally if you're humans, then your communication between your capital and that city is probably going to be pretty bad because there's a mountain range in the way. But say we have races that can fly, is that kind of thing? Yes.
Yeah, like harpies.
I was specifically thinking about the harpy lobby in our Discord.
Harpy lobby.
Are different races going to account for their different terrain attributes in how they kind of control, or like say is there going to be like an incentive for you as the emperor of the High Beavers to have a tolerant enough society so that you can send out harpy messengers and not just have them shot on sight?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's a tricky. I think you're absolutely right. The particulars of it, though, we'll have to sort that out in an efficient way, right? So let's say you have a city on this side, you have a city on this side. If it were harpies that were here and here, that's very little distance. If you are humans or goblins or something like that, then that is a fairly significant distance. And maybe you're humans, and then you have a bunch of harpies that live up in here, and you establish a good relationship. You hire like a bunch of harpies as an agent to be sort of like a messenger corps or something, and then suddenly you're able to exert a lot more control over the mountains on the other side. Or you simply build a road through the mountains, which is crazy expensive, and suddenly you can communicate a lot better. But yeah, I think go ahead.
Hire the dwarves to build you a tunnel.
The dwarves, that's right. But I mean, right here actually is not this is a good example of like an area that if you wanted to go from the mountains here to the coast, that would be a pretty crazy area to traverse. But right here, it's kind of rough terrain, but not impossible to. Right, same over here, right? But it's still likely what we'll do is during World Gen we'll probably have to calculate a whole bunch of probable paths because we can't constantly have agents evaluating tile by tile where they want to go because we need quantum computers. But we'll probably calculate a whole litany of likely paths, and then kind of agents make their decisions off of those multitudes of preset paths. But yeah, your general case with different races being able to handle the terrain differently, which influences the control that they can exert. That'll also apply to armies when armies are marching as well, right? Is if you're able to deal with certain types of terrain or situations better, then you can have a significant advantage.
I guess to go on that theme is, to what extent do we need to be prepared to answer questions that we don't have answers to in reality because of fantastic? So, for example, whilst the captain brings up, being able to hire some harpies, what if, just because of my sheer insane luck that I have as cowboy, what if I just spawn in on a field with a bunch of Pegasi? And, now my entire kingdom's culture is based around breeding Pegasi. Even if I'm a human settlement or whatever.
That actually tied into my thoughts on how are we going to model things like mounts, and how different cultures would domesticate different things, and a different race might be able to domesticate different things, and like you said, you might have an entire culture that's like Warhammer Britannia and kept afloat because, hey, we have Pegasus Knights.
Right. Well, to Cowboys, to answer Cowboys' question first, I would say that sounds awesome. Like, cool. I would say it's the game doing what it's supposed to do. I mean, and that's the great thing about Songs of Aeons, hopefully, is that we're not necessarily worried about game balance for the player themselves. Like, if you happen to be in a situation that you can exploit to maximum effect, that's great. The issue is if everyone everywhere ends up breeding Pegasi because it's just overpowered, and soon you just have a world overrun by humans with Pegasi. Then we failed from a game design perspective. But from what you're
Presumably there'd be...
Wait, what?
But even with horses, that's a good example, because throughout almost all of Imperial Chinese history, they had really serious issues breeding really good horses, and had to rely on trade with their northern steppe neighbors because they just couldn't do it right.
Right.
So we could even if there are certain mounts, it's like, oh my gosh, this place is great for Pegasi. Just because they're somewhere in the world and one culture has learned how to domesticate them doesn't mean that they would naturally spread as well. Maybe everybody wants to buddy up with these people to get their hands on their Pegasi riders, but they probably can't themselves get that.
Yeah, so ideally, in this, so I think what Cowboys probably worried about is, okay, so Pegasi are better than horses, so Pegasi are just going to be fucking everywhere, and everyone's going to have Pegasi, and they're going to just be But I guess the idea is you'd want in cases like with Pegasi, you'd want to balance them the way you'd want to balance races, right? And so with a Pegasi, you could assume that they need special kinds of food. They need to be like elves in the sense that they need all of these spices and nutrients and special kinds of it takes you 10 times. They grow way slower, and so you have to spend way more time raising them. And so
not just that, but you could look at it just from a physics standpoint, and you could say, well, yeah, your Pegasi Knights can fly, but unlike your horses that
can't be armored, right?
Your armor is going to weigh so much that you're never going to have heavy Pegasi cavalry. You're never going to have your Pegasus, a lot of actual knight horses. The heavy horses, the horses had armor, but you can't really do that to something that flies under its own power, which is like harpies. Your harpies are never going to have harpy knights that wear armor and still fly.
Right.
Yeah, you're endangering yourself by angering the harpy lobbies. I don't know if you want to do this.
You mean harpies aren't sexy and all powerful? They can't wear armor. But yeah, I mean, we had early on. We always had the same conversation about like dragons too, right? You introduce this fantastical thing, and in Dungeons and Dragons, it's not an issue because you're not really accounting for their broader influence on society and stuff like that. But you basically have to balance, the fantastical thing so that it fits into the world in a way that doesn't completely trivialize the mundane parts of the world. So like a dragon, like an ancient dragon that's capable of laying waste to an entire civilization needs some kind of life history modifications to make it not just destroy the entire world and no one has any recourse in it. So they sleep for 500 years and then they wake up and eat stuff for a couple of years and they go back to sleep or something. Yeah, we have to basically, those fantastical things need to be able to shine, but they also need to have their place, and that's just that's just a balance issue, really.
This is a good point to bring in, which is balance around military stuff.
Go ahead.
How how do you balance any military? I mean, I guess one of the approaches is just we don't, right? I mean, in lots of grand strategy games, there is no such thing as quote-unquote balance if a nation is bigger enough than the other nation.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I mean, historically, even if you are a much larger, stronger nation, it didn't necessarily mean that you could concentrate all of your force against your smaller enemies, right? It's like, well, okay, yeah, you have 1 million people in your army. Can you get them all in one place and feed them and not have them all die of dysentery?
I guess what I'm saying is not so much that as if we're again bringing in the fantastical elements to bear. If we're in a fantastical setting, for example, and say that I, as a tryhard, immediately when SotE is released, I immediately set up a multiplayer game in which, it's pure tryharding. Why would every player not play, I don't know, Knowles and just breed out humanity in every other race in the world to have those sweet Knowles super troops?
Presumably, you'd have some kind of, counteracting costs. Like, everything would presumably have some kind of a trade-off, right? Like, oh yeah, you can breed super fast, but you also die super fast, which means that your population accrues knowledge.
You're more likely to descend into infighting.
Yeah,
blah, blah, blah.
Your leaders. You get this one super awesome general, and oops, he's dead in a year because Knowles only lived 30 years max. Like, oh hey, yeah, we've got a dragon. He's gonna help us. Yay, woo! Oh, he's gonna go sleep for a century now. Like, presumably there'd be some element of that mixed with kind of, I guess, assuming that if you have enough crazy stuff, the crazy stuff counters itself. Like,
yeah, the thing is,
everybody has something that's crazy OP, then nothing is crazy OP.
It's really like the quote unquote crazy OP stuff. Like, it's, I guess, Calandiel and I have this conversation all the time where we talk about magic and how do you prevent magic from just being totally awesome and blowing everything else away, so why bother with anything else? Like, the idea is that everything ends up getting tied to some kind of resource that exists in the game, right? And so if you can cast this meteor swarm or something like that, then there has to be some kind of corresponding resource that's being used, which is costly in its own way.
I mean, you could limit magic in a very easy way. You could just tie it to the agent system so that it's like, oh, well, your country doesn't have magic. You have individual mages, and sure, this one mage may become super powerful, but A, how do you keep him loyal, and B, what do you do when he dies and suddenly you lose 200 years of him being an awesome mage. Like,
Yeah, and you over rely on them or something like that.
If you tied tech to the whole civilization, but magic to individual agents, I think that you could have like kind of an interesting dichotomy there, where it's like in some settings that are further along, it's like, well, what happens when the Industrial Revolution happens? Oh, well, magic basically fades from importance. Why? Well, because you can either have an enchanter make you one really awesome sword, or you can have a factory produce you 10,000 guns.
Right, yeah.
And so, like, in this kind of, the analogy here would be, oh, yeah, well, you can invest all your resources into, I'm going to establish a mage training school, and everything's going to go great. And then, all your powerful mages start feuding with each other and killing each other, or opening a portal to a demon realm, and suddenly, oh, my investment just combusted itself. Or I'm going to take the less flashy, less, amazing route of, I'm going to invest in, my soldiers having marginally better armor. And yeah, it may not be as spectacular as having one character who can, blow up an army, but you're also like not going to have to worry that slightly better armor is going to stage a coup against you, or going to launch their own kingdom, or be possessed by a demon, or whatever.
That's
Yeah.
a great picture. That slightly better armor is going to stage a coup against me. Oh, no,
but whatever the case, like everything needs to be constrained by some kind of resource, that is accumulated or and disposed of when you do the awesome thing. So, like, in so many videos, like, you get like World of Warcraft or something, you have like a level amazing character, and you rampage through a newbie zone and just kill everything, and nothing can stand against you. Like, in an actual living world, it completely screws everything up, and so the idea of magic that is not drawing on some source which is limited either in the rate you can accumulate it or in its ultimate quantity, like, it just can't happen. There has to be some kind of corresponding cost. It's just that, unlike resources that are like iron or tin or something like that, magic, what I imagine is that magic has oftentimes a much more blunter, prompt effects on what you're trying to do versus, mundane resources like iron, right? So let's say your society has X amount of effort. You can spend it, like you were saying, Captain, on the 10,000 swords, or the guy that like throws a fireball or something, right? Like, you can see how those two things, if the guy can throw 10 fireballs, which can destroy an army or whatever, and you've got the 10,000 swords, they're both powerful in their own ways, and they're different kinds of instruments, and so you use them in a different strategic fashion than you from one another. But the guy with the fireballs can't just keep casting fireballs all day long without any kind of constraint on his behavior, because then it's just, you can't balance around that. It works fine in Dungeons and Dragons or whatever, but it just doesn't work in a living world. And you have weird stuff. I'm going to use my fireballs to light up that forest, or to power this furnace here, and you have all these weird situations that completely throw off the balance of the world.
Well, I mean, presumably, if you're using that kind of high-level magic, it's going to have side effects, right? So you could have all kinds of... You could make magic very risky, where, like, oh, yeah, your mage... Your mage, you can order him to try to, go out there and be a one-man army, but you could very, very easily trigger some kind of disaster, or you could even, like, go to the, it was a D&D setting called Dark Sun, where magic actually sapped, like, life from the world by using it, and, like, overuse of magic basically turned that entire fantasy setting planet into like this barren desert wasteland where like mages ended up getting hunted by people who wanted to preserve what little was left of the place you could live in.
Yeah, it's a little too open-ended. Like, I've got my head stuck in all these gazillion variables that we're calculating and how they all influence one another, and so I'm always thinking in terms of how do you organically constrain certain aspects of the game so they don't run away from you. Anyone who watches the stream will occasionally see what happens when a variable gets away from me, right? You end up with a giant vortex in the middle of the world or something. You get really totally wacky, bizarre things. And so I'm always thinking in terms of when it comes to a system, how do you build in resistance to extremes the more you get away from a particular equilibrium? And so simply having sort of constraining the awesomeness of magic simply by having, for instance, unpredictable effects or things like that is very hard from a design perspective to balance and constrain so that it doesn't completely overwhelm other aspects of the game. So it's...
I guess another way you could theoretically do it is to maybe make the total amount of magic in the world semi-finite.
Yeah.
So that, like, the more magic using actors you have, the less energy each of them would, like, maybe like each of them contributes a little bit to the overall pool so that it's like not totally tapped out, but so that there's like a cap, so that it's like, oh well, yeah, each magical actor you have adds this percentage to the total, but they all have to draw off a common pool. So if you have a lot of people using magic, it's limited to being pretty weak. Whereas if you have only a few people, it becomes stronger. Or if you conduct some kind of campaign to intentionally kill off your enemy's agents who are using magic, maybe you could boost your own power that way. Or maybe it drives you to do other extreme things, like maybe it's like, oh, well, the way you can temporarily boost your magic output is huge amounts of human sacrifice, and I'm going to depopulate this entire region to try and beat my enemy in magic.
Right. Well, that's legit, because then the humans are the resources that are being consumed, right?
Exactly. Like I'm saying that, like, you could make the either actors or population, like the population or the actors themselves kind of become the resource in that case.
Right, yeah.
And like, again, like if you're using a very powerful wizard and you're like, oh, this wizard is super powerful, but every time you use them, there's a certain percentage chance they burn themselves to dust. They themselves become a consumable resource. It's like, how many times do I want to risk this before I really need it?
Right. Yeah. No, that's a legit approach too. But yeah, so that's from a, I guess, kind of from a programming perspective, like you can kind of technically, right, the variable, the consumable variable is the individual, and you can kind of calculate how much they can do, right, before they get consumed, and so therefore what their resource value is. So it's, yeah, I mean that's an interesting approach, but it all goes back to what Cowboy originally said about well, what happens when you have Pegasus all over the place or whatever. It's like you have to find meaningful and relatively reliable ways to constrain these powerful things so that they don't run amok. And I always think of it in terms of almost some degree of elasticity, where you kind of need, what am I trying to say? Forget what I was just saying about elasticity. I just realized we're getting far away from the topic of warfare per se. We might want to go back to it before we deviate too far, because magic, we could probably talk for hours and hours. And
magical use in warfare, I guess the question would be, so we're talking about, oh, well, what if a general goes rogue, or what if an army goes rogue, and how do you control this and how do you control that? I guess one question would be, would a potential reason to not send all your magical users into a war being, A, they could all get killed and mess up your ability to do other stuff magically, or if you use too much magic, you risk causing really bad things to happen. Would that be like a factor in warfare calculation?
It could.
I can,
The issue right now, and the reason why we're having a little bit of a difficult time with this conversation is because right now Magic, SOT is kind of build your own fantasy world type thing and live in it. And like the Magic system may end up being, modular in the sense that you can have different types of magic, right? So, maybe I want, a necromancy that involves consuming humans, and I also want to have, a magic system that has, conventional mana, and maybe I want a magic system that works off of blood magic or, land magic. And so we're kind of, in having this conversation, we're also just kind of having a general magic conversation. But I guess if we want to distill it down to warfare, like, it simply has to be balanced in such a way that it does not trivialize or completely overshadow conventional warfare with good old-fashioned swords and spears and, bows.
Of course.
Well, gentlemen, sirs, gotta go now. Pleasure talking to you.
Okay, cool.
As I leave, I'm just gonna steer the conversation. How are you guys planning on dealing with naval stuff, naval warfare, or even underwater stuff if we ever get to that point? Where communication isn't like I can only get a couple letters per month, but it's just, once you send the fleet, you're never going to hear from them again until they come back with them.
Oh, this actually, we should talk about how warfare is like the actual gameplay of warfare. Like, that's something we definitely want to cover, and we'll go on the naval part. But I think it's actually kind of important that we talk about like how you actually send your armies out and how they do the things that they do. And so like in a game like Total War or Europa Universalis, you kind of have this very fluid control of your army, and like it's especially bad in like the Paradox games because you can have your soldiers just kind of running around in circles, and who knows, you'd actually in real life be tying like your supply line in knots and all kinds of crazy stuff. But in reality, armies rarely behaved in that kind of way. You wouldn't normally split them into a million pieces and move all over the place. And so really, and it also it's a nightmare on the AI and on performance because you're constantly, every army in the game that's moving around is constantly for the AI having to recalculate their path and reevaluate based on every little move that the player makes, and it's problematic.
Which is why the EU4 AI looks like it's dancing.
Exactly, because it's constantly having, and it's also why it's so easy to game the AI, because the player simply has an ahistorical amount of control of like their armies. The same thing is true with Total War games on the battlefield, right? Like you're giving your peasant levies all of these ridiculous, elaborate orders. Okay, you're going to go around this army, you're going to strike from behind, and you're going to fall back, and you're going to go over here, and you're going to strike this other flank, and it's like, no, they couldn't do any of that, So basically the idea that we have on the table right now is that you plan a campaign ahead of time. When you want to march an army out from your capital, and you want to march to this faraway land, and you want to annex it or raid it or whatever, you basically, you have a call to arms to begin with. You gather your soldiers. You plan out the path that you're going to take nominally. You figure out the supplies that you're going to bring with you, the kind of supplies you're going to have along the way. And then you kind of, it's almost like you would go on like a D&D adventure in a sense, that things happen to you along the way. Your agents that are a part of your army are evaluating what they're doing along the way and how they want to act in certain situations. Maybe, you have standing orders that, since you don't have all the supplies that you need and you're living off the land, you have standing orders to pay for the things that, that you take from the locals, but some of your mercenary auxiliaries from the steppe decide they're just going to take whatever the hell they want, and suddenly you have a problem on your hands that you have to resolve through an event or something like that. And so basically you go on kind of this adventure in a campaign, and usually it would occur within a campaigning season, and you'd be back in time for the harvest, hopefully. And if you do things like, if you want to bring along, levies and farmers and stuff like that with you, you have to deal with the consequences of not getting back in time or not getting back with them intact, And so a military campaign itself would have all of these other far-reaching consequences as far as the relationship with the people of the lands that you're traveling through, but also consequences for people back home depending on the outcome of those campaigns, right? And you could probably, alter the course of the campaign depending on how it's going, or abort it if it's not going well. But you wouldn't be just sending your armies all over the case, running around in circles. And you would, your army itself would kind of be a cloud across the landscape, influencing the area around it, and influencing the provinces that it's going through, right? So most of your military campaigns aren't going to be perfectly supplied, right? The number of armies, especially in the earlier times, that were completely supplied and who were always getting a living wage and everything was pretty uncommon. And so when you're planning your campaign, you would look at the areas you're planning to move in, and you'd ask yourself, like, is there enough food for me to actually survive in this with an army of this size, right? Maybe I need to send a smaller army so that I don't have attrition from hunger and things like that. And you would also be asking yourself and evaluating, like, okay, so if my army is going through here and I do want them to forge, that means more of them are going to be out foraging. They're going to be more vulnerable to guerrilla warfare and ambushes and things like that. You'll be considering this kind of stuff, when you're planning your campaign. And like just getting to your destination safely and getting the objective is kind of like the end result, but so much more would happen along the way that would be interesting. And then and a lot of the military campaigns you'd be going on would probably just be, especially if you're a younger society that's smaller, might just be like, okay, I'm going on my yearly raid of my enemies over here to keep them weak and to take their stuff, and to get slaves or to, extort tribute, stuff like that. But yeah, so that was long-winded, but that's the general idea with planning your campaign ahead of time. And then, sometimes you could be like the Ottomans and their constant, like getting to Vienna was this huge challenge. Getting there in time to siege it before winter occurred, was this, ask Napoleon too, right? It's this significant project. And that's what I'd like military campaigns to be, is like in Total War or in EU4, it's just kind of like this afterthought. You just send your soldiers over there, and it's like, it's this easy thing. In fact, it was this monumental project, and successfully planning a campaign and annexing territory along the way was very complicated and very and it should feel like you successfully achieving that would be like this very satisfying project to complete. So there we have it. Any follow-up questions? No name, you've been quiet for a while. You still out there? Or typical name?
Yeah, I'm still here. I didn't really want to interrupt people. I was thinking something about magic earlier, but I don't want to get too off topic.
Yeah, well, let's
Like how would controlling the army works? Like you just send it out, and then like it comes back later. Like kind of like the only game I can think of that's done anything remotely similar to this is Emperor Rise of the Middle Kingdom.
Well, I think it would be depending on if you go with it, right? So, for instance, you could either pick that trusted general, and you say, hey, man, here's the campaign route I want you to go by. I'm going to set a little setting to give you some liberty. If you're doing extra good, maybe you can go up this valley and subjugate something, And depending on their temperament and their ambitiousness, they would follow the route that you set out. And in most cases, like I said, depending on their attributes, would try to achieve the objective. And maybe you could give them some instruction like, hey man, if you want to be extra aggressive to make sure you get there, feel free. But then if you want to lead the army yourself, then you would go with the army and have much more control over what you're able to achieve along the campaigning route. You'd be the one directly getting the events to deal with the peasants that you accidentally stole the chickens from or whatever. Or you would deal with the event where, the auxiliaries are angry because you promised them a bunch of loot and you've only raided, a few cows or something like that. And so if you go on the campaign yourself and you're leading the army, you get those events, you make those decisions. If it's the general, they're the ones, responding to those events and making decisions as they go, right?
How much of an impact will magic have on this? Like for example, can you build crystal balls to actually so that you actually can communicate with your army?
That's a cool idea right there, actually.
For how about magical armies in general? I imagine the logistics are a little bit different for the Lich King and his horde of skeletons than they are for your conventional.
That's true.
And his army of peasants.
Those are all good points, actually.
I remember in Dominions, my friend likes to play Lemuria, and fighting against him is a huge giant pain because he can just amass thousands and thousands of ghosts, and same with Airmore and thousands of skeletons, and just not have to feed them, and trying to invade this place is a fucking nightmare, because your troops do need to eat food.
Yeah, I think
I would imagine necromancy would be if necromancy is going to be in the game, would be a pretty huge game changer.
Sure. Well, I think one of the great parts about having these kinds of rules and systems is that the kind of ideas you have can kind of be a way to amend them in interesting strategic ways. So the crystal ball idea is funny, or even just you have a magical connection with your magical army or something, and it would have to be something that's costly enough that it's not just something everybody does or whatever. But yeah, those are interesting ways to possibly get around those issues, or even more conventional means let's say you decide to stay in the capital, you send your general out, but you breed really great horses, and so if you get news, if it looks like the campaign's not going the way you had insisted it should go, you send out some of your super fast horses and you say, "What the fuck are you doing?" And you threaten them to follow your orders or whatever. So there's lots of ways to deal with that beyond simply sitting in the capital, sending out your general, and then just waiting for him to show up 8 months later. But your ideas, I like those magic ideas. Crystal balls, kind of an interesting idea, or you can kind of
every general a palantir.
Right, but yeah, that's the thing, is you'd have to make sure everyone doesn't have it. But that's good comment.
Well, if your enemy captured it, they would instantaneously have direct lines on all your communications.
That's true. Yeah. So anything is actually to deviate to make sure we answer Cowboy's point. What gave me sort of the campaign idea to begin with was in Europa Universalis 4 when I was doing a bunch of modding on something involving naval warfare or something, and it occurred to me I was reading about a lot of how 16th and 17th century naval expeditions were organized. If you were the English and you wanted to conquer Jamaica or something like that, it wasn't just like an EU4 where you're sort of willy-nilly moving your boats around and you land some troops and then you go back and pick up some more and you bring some more. It was this huge undertaking, and you knew that when you sent out your ships with your sailors and your troops, most of them weren't going to come back just because they were all going to die from disease and stuff, and it was this huge undertaking and all of this provisioning and all of this preparation that needed to be done and all of this planning. And so, I got to thinking about military campaigns too, and it's really a similar situation. But I imagine, with naval expeditions, you kind of have a similar case. As you were planning your campaigns, if your capital's here, you want your armies to meet at the Delta here at the port city, and then load up and go somewhere, and your ability to project power with naval power would be significant, but also leave you quite vulnerable in the event that for some reason, you lose contact with your ships, or they sink from a storm or something like that. I would imagine that we would also have some micro weather events in ocean provinces. That you would have the event, you check to see if there's any ships there, and then then you would decide whether they get the system would decide whether they get smashed, and depending on seaworthy the men are and the ships are, then you'd have that influence the campaign. I mean, the reason why the reason why Granada and the Almoravids didn't recapture Seville was basically due to that kind of event where even in a small distance between two land masses of water, the land army was cut off from its supply on the other side of the straits. But so yeah, that's the naval aspect there.
Actually, kind of tying into the naval thing and like going back to some of this before, like cultures and traditions. So like in real history, like you look at like British naval history, and it took them like 200 years to develop the kind of institutions and traditions and practices to actually you think it's easy. It's like, oh well, we got a few boats, we're gonna go do some naval stuff, but it turns out that it's like, oh well, you have to maintain the boats, you have to feed the people, you have to secure the supply of wood for new masts, and like that ended up with like the British, the Royal Navy ended up like buying everything down to the forests and running its own farms because it was the only way it could guarantee food and wood and stuff. So is that kind of a thing, whether it's naval or any other type of specialized warfare, like naval warfare, magical warfare, etc., is that kind of thing going to be represented in like a where in order to be good at something that's specialized, you have to invest a lot of time and effort?
Sure, and not just that, but your culture too needs to be acclimatized to that kind of behavior. Just sticking a bunch of steppe people on a boat and be here, row this oar or something. Like, no, you can't. This doesn't work, of course. But in Europa Universalis and in Total War, right? It's like, oh, I have a port city, cool. I can build heavy ships now, or I can build galleys now, and it just wasn't anything like that. What was so interesting in Europe was, like, you had a few places, especially, in the early Renaissance, you had a few places that actually built boats, and then anyone else who wanted, like, a navy would then buy boats from these few shipyards, So even just when it came to building the boats themselves, like, and oftentimes, you'd hire mercenary ships, or it wasn't worth having a navy for yourself, and so you would just conscript like merchant ships in order to move the troops to the places they needed to go, And so I think like having a major part of succeeding in naval warfare is actually having a culture that's geared toward seamanship, and not just seamanship, but like activities involved with the ocean, fishing, pearling, all kinds of stuff like that. Commerce, most of all, right? So the Venetians, had this wonderful virtuous cycle where, their ability to project military might by the seas improved their mercantile activity at the seas, which then, you had this revolving door between the merchant marine and the actual navy that complemented, that made them incredible at naval warfare. You had this little tiny city with, it was a pretty big city by European standards, but the population of Venice was like really quite small compared to most other polities, but they had this outrageously outsized naval power, and that was because I think of that kind of virtuous cycle.
So, like, to take that in a slightly, so that would be full of other things, right? Like, so if you had like taking this in a slightly fantasy direction, but also, earlier we were talking about ice ages. So say you have a game that's set during kind of a colder period. Could you potentially see like a steppe dwelling people who have like, I don't know, something like mammoth cavalry as their special adaptation, and like they kind of center so much of their culture around these large dominant animals in their ecosystem, and then they take them to war?
Yeah, I definitely expect that kind of thing to occur often, and I think that there needs to be resistance, quite a bit of resistance to a particular culture deciding like, oh, I've never like ridden on mammoths before, but go ahead and stick me on a mammoth, and I'll go ahead and I'll ride into battle. Like, that shouldn't be something that's that's easy to do. So someone in chat mentioned, what if a non-sea experienced people conquered sea experienced peoples? And that's interesting because you actually see a historical example when it comes to the Achaemenid Empire in Persia. That's exactly what they did. They conquered the Phoenicians. The Persians didn't have a heck of a lot of seafaring experience up in the dry mountains of Persia, but they then, because they had a tolerant society, a tolerant empire that kind of let the Phoenicians do what they want, as long as they paid their taxes and showed up for war, they basically were able to use the Phoenicians' seamanship to its maximum effect. And so I think anyone who read the race profile will notice that, I was talking about humans being the people the race who were best able to generally assimilate other races into their society and use their individual exceptionalisms, both culturally and racially. And so I think, Isdar, that would definitely, if you had a very united but xenophobic society, you might be great at the thing that you did, and if you tried to conquer a sea people, it would be difficult to use their seamanship experience just because of just because you probably are going to treat them like crap as a xenophobic society. But if you were a tolerant society that annexed those people and treated them magnanimously and dealt with them with just enough of a firm fist to keep them in the sphere of your influence, but kind enough that they're willing to follow you, then you ideally would be able to use the agents of their society in your army and use their ships and things like that. No name or typical name. Anything else?
So, unrelated question. How detailed, is the military going to be? Is this going to be like EU4 where you got, infantry, cavalry, artillery, or is this going to be like Dominions where you have, just dozens and dozens of different unit types?
That's a good question. So, so here's one thing we haven't really covered yet. Ideally, you would have sort of units as enumerations per se. Okay, so we have ground unit types, and they are spearmen, swordsmen, blah, 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 blah. But those individuals need to have the characteristics of the pop that they came from, too. And that could be racial characteristics, right? Okay, I'm an orc, I'm really strong. Or goblin, I'm, small and weak. And then they also need to have the characteristics of is this population already experienced in warfare? What kind of weapons do they actually have, available to them? Things like that. And then different unit types need to have they need to have capacities that exist beyond simply their value in a pitched battle. And so it goes back to the whole campaigning thing, right? Along the way, you need individuals who are, if you're living off the land, you need individuals who are good at finding food quickly. You need individuals that are able to scout well. You need possibly individuals that need to be able to be good in skirmishing. And so you could actually be if you have an elvish settled race, they might specialize in skirmishing, and when their army kind of combines with yours, it'll be dodgy and evasive and diffuse, and kind of be fighting you, in this guerrilla type of way. And so, I don't I think what ideally we'll have is this vast continuum of type of units you can have due to the variability of pops themselves, right? Depending on their race, depending on how well they're nourished, right? All of the data that exists on the pop in the tile will be brought to bear in the effectiveness of a particular agent within an army, right? So a lord, up in the hinterlands up here, basically, grabs the 50 most capable young men in his little fiefdom, and those people are naturally good at hunting the mountain goats that live up in here. And so therefore, they're going to be pretty good at skirmishing or something like that based on the lifestyle that they had. And so, yeah, those guys happen to be archers, the base unit of archers, but they bring along the characteristics of the pop that were there. And you might also have archers, same kind of base unit out someplace like here in a very different environment. And those archers may only be archers because they've been given specific drill training, because they're normally just farmers, and on the weekends they happen to get together to train a little bit to be a capable military unit. And so the nature of those archers are going to be different than the base unit of the nature of the archers over here, who have very different lifestyles. Maybe the guys over here, they don't eat very well, and so they have low morale, and they're kind of weak. They don't get enough protein because the area is overpopulated. Like that kind of data, because the unit itself is connected to the population as a data type, we should be able to bring in those characteristics to influence the unit itself. So the idea is, what I said at the beginning of the stream, is we want to bring in the economic factors of the game. We want to bring in the demographic factors of the game to have it very heavily influence how warfare is fought, as well as the kind of soldiers that you bring into the battle, and what they can do for you. And that kind of will determine how you also want to fight too. If you are the elves, who naturally have a lot of bowmanship and stuff like that because of the environment they live in and the lifestyle that they live, you're going to want to have to fashion a strategy that is complementary to that lifestyle, and not just send them out into a set-piece battle to get massacred. That was
Are soldiers tracked like as individuals, or as like in Dominions, or is it more like Victoria 2, where they're tracked as like demographic units?
They will have to be part of. They'll have to be part of POPs, more or less, population units, and a population unit has a certain number of individuals that belong to it, and characteristics. Mainly, you can imagine we have 2 million tiles, and we'll have lots of provinces, and at a certain point, we have to aggregate things for memory management purposes, right?
Yeah, I agree with that.
And, this is everything we're saying, too, is aspirational, and some of our aspirations have been tuned due to the reality of programming as we know it. But as we go along, too, we may find that we have a lot more room or a lot less room than we think we have. And so everything is obviously subject to change, but this is kind of what we kind of want to do at the moment.
So how would the pop system track particularly powerful mages or the general or something? Like, would there be like characters attached to the army that are separate from the pops?
So Cal and I have been talking about how to implement characters properly, and a promotion system where you have sort of tiers of characters. You obviously can't have every single person in the world making very complex decisions, because until we have quantum computers, that's not practical. And so you have sort of like tiers of characters where more advanced characters have a broader scope of things that they can do in the world, and greater data to draw on and decision making and things like that. And so if you had that super powerful mage, you would expect them to kind of be a higher tier character who's making more advanced decisions. Whereas if you have that mage guild of little guys who shoot fire darts or something, like, they're all kind of sort of a lower tier character that has way more limited decision making, and they would like aggregate into groups, and so that way you save on on calculations as far as decision making is concerned. So, yeah, any other questions?
How would supply lines work for the army? Is that abstracted? Do you need to actively manage them? Do they take a big wheelbarrow full of food with them on the campaign? Do they live off the land? How does that work?
Yeah, well, we'd like to be able to represent logistics as accurately as possible. It also goes back to, most earlier societies just aren't going to have logistics. They're just going to be like, all right, take 5 days worth of food and then eat whatever we can along the way. And oftentimes they won't be traveling far enough to justify much logistics, But like I said earlier, like the reason we could have more of a realistic logistics system in this system is that we're accounting for the planning of campaigns, right? And so you would plan like, okay, we're going to go from this province to this province, and we're going to make our route through here. And, therefore, the route that we've chosen is the route that our supply line is going to be, right? So yeah, that's the general idea with how it would work. And you would have to decide, along the way, are we going to be buying food, or are we going to be stealing food, or are we going to have a stockpile in our capital that is transported along these specific lines, that kind of thing. And then because we have so much granularity in the detail of the world, we're able to pragmatically implement a system because we actually do have units of food. We actually do have regosity of the train that you are trying to transport food over, so we know how hard it is to transport food over a given train or through a given path and things like that, right? And what's great is that we also have, the variables in order to have uncertain things happen, like ships being wrecked and then, your dudes being cut off, supply-wise. And so that's one of the benefits of creating a living world, is that you're able to capture all of these essential things that make logistics work, And the constraint of the campaigning concept, the fact that it is constrained in that way, makes a logistics system way more practical. Did I answer your question?
I think so.
I get excited and go off on tangents sometimes. All right, so I guess it's been almost 2 hours. If you guys have any more pressing questions, we can answer them. I don't want it to go too long, but I think we covered most of the things I wanted to cover. There's probably a few more things to cover as far as a society's military tradition and institutional knowledge, so to speak, and things like that. And like I mentioned earlier, a really important thing, I guess, that I kind of touched on earlier is how feral societies and pastoral or nomadic people are able to have parity with civilized societies. And what's funny is that every other strategy game is absolutely horrible at capturing this phenomenon. Is what's interesting is in history, the nomadic peoples, or people who aren't settled per se, and more advanced societies, more developed societies, those people often have a habit of kicking the asses of all of the settled people. And it's not because they have more population per se. There's almost always fewer of them per se, but their lifestyle itself, their rougher lifestyle that involves either a lot more moving around or developing skills in their civilian life that are transmissible to military life, those things give them, an inherent advantage. It gives the non-settled people the ability to put virtually everyone in their society under arms at the same time. Whereas if you are the Chinese on the Yangtze Delta and 98% of the people in your society are farmers, and those skills don't transmit very well to warfare, most of whom have never even left their village, how are they going to go on campaign? Then sure, you've got a lot of people, but you can't put all of them under arms at the same time because A, not everyone can leave the fields, and B, they don't necessarily have the skills right out of the gate that they need to go to war. And so you either have to spend a lot of their day training them, in which case they're not being as efficient at their whole settled life farming thing, or you well, I mean, that's it, right? You have to professionalize them to some extent, and they're using some of their effort that would normally be used to grow food or do whatever else they're doing. Whereas a feral society, you can easily pick them up, shove a spear into their hands, and they're like, oh, I know how to hunt. We move around all the time anyway. I'm used to traveling. We know how to find water. We know how to live off the land because we've been doing this already, and so going off to war is no big deal. What's interesting, like with the Mongolians, is like there was like literally societally wise, you had like one Mongolian for every 100 Chinese. But the steppe people, they were already cavalrymen as part of their lifestyle. They were already archers as part of their lifestyle. They didn't need logistics because their lifestyle already pretty much covered it. I mean, they had logistics later on in more advanced campaigns into China and stuff like that. But when you can just milk your horse, cut its neck, and mix the blood with the milk and live off of that while you're on campaign, like, those are all just skills they had in their civilian life that were transmissible. And so this is how we'd like to give feral societies parity in some ways with civilized societies, is this ability to put way more of their people under arms at the same time, even though there are way less of those people.
So speaking of like culture and traditions and stuff, how does the player choose what they want to play as? Like, is this going to be like an EU4 type game where it generates a bunch of nations on the map and you click, I want to play as this people? Or is it going to be like, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but like where you like set design your nation from scratch and say, I want to play a nation with this trait, this trait, this trait, and I'll put them on this spot in the world.
I mean, it's that type of custom situation is going to be way harder to do because there are so many. So it's kind of like a map editor, for instance. Like there are quite a few things that you can't do when it comes to editing a map, because simply by altering terrain or whatever, like, that doesn't account for the geological history that would have created that terrain to begin with. And so it's kind of hard to explain. Like, so let's say you do want to make a custom society, and you plop them down in a specific type of climate, right? And you say, hey, I want you guys to grow this kind of food. I want you to have this kind of lifestyle. I want you to engage in this kind of behavior and have these kinds of cultural values. The likelihood is, as soon as you start the game, they're all going to starve to death because they don't produce enough surpluses to survive or to sustain the economy that they need to sustain, or to get the iron they need from nearby societies in order to build the tools to do the kind of farming that they're supposed to do. Like, because we're dealing with such a complex system, customizing your own civilization, unless you're extremely skilled and they're extremely experienced, would be like deciding that you're going to take a bunch of people who lived in the Khmer Empire and then plunk them into Scotland and expect them to survive. The likelihood is that there's going to be this turmoil period where they're maladapted to the society that they exist in. It's no different than taking an animal from anywhere in the world and plopping it into a different ecosystem. Likely is it's probably going to die, because it's not adapted to the thing that you.
What if it were kind of like Dwarf Fortress, where, if I remember correctly, it'll highlight little spots in the map where this would be a good spot to put your city or whatever. You would say, I want to play as nomadic horse people, and then it would search for spots where here, and here are good spots for that kind of lifestyle, kind of thing.
Possibly, if you were to plunk your society down. I mean, one of the big issues is that the world in Dwarf Fortress, like when you start your fortress, you're not really starting a complex society. There's a few dozen people or whatever in Dwarf Fortress that you start out managing. It just, what I expect to happen is people will generate worlds, they will age their worlds, they will stop at a period that seems interesting, and then they will pick the society that they want to play with. Or what I'm also expecting, who knows what remember this game is moddable and everything, and people can probably start their own directories of worlds or whatever. I'm thinking what's probably going to end up happening is you're going to have certain players out there who create really awesome, interesting, fascinating worlds, and they'll age them, they'll pause them at a specific point in that world's history. And then what I suspect will happen is that you'll have sub-communities of people who play the game who will be interested in that world at a specific point. So it'll be almost like, you could have 20 really popular worlds that just arise organically. People aggregate around them. And so people will be as familiar with those worlds as, like, people are familiar with the EU4 map, And so it'll be like, when someone talks about, the Merchant Republic and such, like, the people in that community will know, like, oh, yeah, those guys, I'm going to play as those guys, or something like that. I have a feeling that's probably what's going to happen. And that, yeah, some people will still generate their own worlds and play them, but I suspect that you'll have sort of, like, organically arising canon worlds in the community that people end up being really interested in because they ended up with the right configuration of geology and ecology and geopolitics at a specific moment in time, But if people don't end up going that way, I suspect people will gen their own worlds, they'll age them, and what we might even have is tools that will occasionally pause the world every X number of years, evaluate the world for the criteria you want, right? Oh, I want to play in a specific location as a specific culture, and so you leave it on overnight, and then it runs for a while, and then it hits that criteria, it stops, and then you come down and you're like, oh, cool, okay, I guess it found this specific seafaring culture that starts, in an area that's mostly islands, and they have these specific characteristics, right? And so that's another way I would expect that people could find the kind of culture that they wanted, and the kind of the play setting that they would want to. And that's someone in this stream said, oh, you could give us 10 preset worlds or something like that. I suspect that's what we'll do too. But I expect a lot of the community is just gonna come up with some really awesome looking crazy worlds because I fiddle around with the settings or whatever. I have my own biases when I choose different settings for world gen. I'm sure there's gonna be many more minds than just mine or the people on the development team with way cooler ideas for different settings, and I think people are just going to come up with some really cool stuff, and you'll have people who write their own histories of the world and everything at specific moments, and it's the kind of thing I'm hoping for and expecting. And what I would love to have is our own server where people can store their worlds and people can upvote worlds and stuff like that. And so the worlds that are organically just the most interesting end up getting upvoted the most by players, and get the most attention and get the most tender loving care. And so we could almost have sort of a self-sorting process in that regard, so people can get good planets to work with. Because when you get down to it, like, generating these worlds takes a long time. Even on computers like mine, eventually I'm expecting, like, once we age the world, once we, we'll have to age the ecology for like 1,000 years, and then we'll have to age the societies for X number of years. And so I'm expecting that for a lot of people on a lot of computers, they're not going to have the patience to deal with that. And so it would make sense for them to go on to the Songs of the Aeon server and, access worlds that other people have made that they find interesting.
How much do cultures change over time? Like, from what I understand, like, the game, like, takes place, like, it starts in, like, Stone Age, right?
I mean, it's sort of kind of, like, Bronze Age, like, earlier on in the development process, we're going to have a much more narrow center kind of area, so, like, Bronze Age to Renaissance kind of thing, because we have to narrow our scope initially. We're trying to get to a playable game as fast as we can, right? And so, and not to mention, like, the Paleolithic took we don't want most of the game to take place with people just having nothing to do because there's no geopolitics because everything is too simple, Sort of like, so there should be at least, like, at most points in the game, at least one city somewhere, or one confederacy of feral societies. So, yeah.
So I was just thinking, so depending on the breadth of time covered by the game, that's a lot of time for societies to change.
It is, and I don't think, because we're still making a game too. I think certain things will end up probably happening a bit faster. So, I think societies will be rediscovering agriculture a lot faster than they normally would, and be doing other things like that, making certain innovations a bit faster than they normally would. Mainly as a gameplay compromise, right? But yeah, cultures, depending on the race, right, and depending on on other factors, on whether there's selective pressure on that culture, culture should evolve fast enough that the player can notice it and influence it, right? But not so fast that things are in turmoil. Because culture, of course, has pragmatic influence on on how societies operate and how they succeed in different areas. All right, so I guess let's go ahead. I gotta pee real bad, so let's pack it in. It was a good conversation. Veered around a bit. I guess we covered pretty much everything we wanted to. Still a little sad that we didn't get more people, which is, it's a little bit heartening, because it means that you have people who are willing to give to the project, even though they don't really have any say. But would be good to have more of their ideas. But thanks for coming, those who did. Before we leave, I think it might be a good idea to give everyone a little bit of an update where we're at. So as of right now, we're closing in hopefully around the end of 0.2. 0.1 basically was, we created all the basic geology and bedrock and things like that, and oceanography, basic climate. And 0.2 then layers on all of the factors that influence ecology and agriculture, right? And so from elevation data and from bedrock and from the placement of oceans and stuff like that, we are able to determine the kinds of soils that we have. So you see here is a mineral richness map based on whether we have different origins and different bedrock types, right? So bedrock type informs that. Also informs soil texture. And then we also recently did glaciation. This world actually has a lot of land connecting to the poles, and so the ice caps were able to spread significantly more. And so this world, interestingly, has a lot more ice on it, and that has some interesting implications as far as soil is concerned. We were able to calculate the ice ages properly now, and so in this particular location, the ice age kind of went to here, and you can see how all of the glacial melt produced rock flour and stuff like that, and produced these super thick silty soils, right? And you can see how we have an aura of, the ice age came all the way out to here. You can see where the moraines were, right? Where the terminus was, and so it basically furnished all of these otherwise awful locations with lots of glacial silts, which is more fertile and more favorable for agriculture. Same thing down in the south. You can see the ice age influenced it down here. We have our volcanoes producing soil material. We have the bedrock producing soil material. We also have sand dunes now in deserts, which through aeolian processes produce material that influences soil as well. We got all of our water bodies existing as discrete units along with wetlands, and so you can see here's each distinctive tributary from each river. The wetlands are on the periphery. Each river has its own qualities and different sediment load, whether it's navigable, all kinds of interesting information. You can see here are the drainage basins, right? For each, all of these, everything purple here connects, for instance, and drains into this area over here. And so you can see all that. So we've really done a lot in 0.2. And so now what we're going to do is now that we have winds, permeability of the soil, mineral nutrients, rainfall, blah, 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 all those variables, we will now be able to layer on the subtle nuances of different vegetation growth, and whether we have pine woods or broadleaf woods or grasslands or scrublands or things like that. And that'll all influence the type of agriculture you have, the types of animals and societies that exist there that hunt those animals or grow on that lands. And so we should really be getting into a lot of the interesting stuff as of 0.3, where we'll then be putting agents into the world to interact with all of that interesting variability. So that's where we're at. Hopefully, before the end of the year, we'll have 0.2 out with all of its interesting stuff. We were discussing the possibility of doing a 0.175 just to give people a little bit more to play with. We'll figure that out. But, we'll see. Thanks for coming, everyone. It's been crazy fun to work on this and also crazy fun to talk with you guys and nerd out on all this stuff. And it's been one of the most enjoyable experiences of my life. So, cool. I'll see you guys later. And we'll have another High Council meeting, hopefully in another month or so, where we'll select a new topic. And anyone from High Council can posit a new subject that we can discuss for the next time. I'll see you next time.